Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our discussion panel called Communication and Climate Justice. My name is Carla Drury, and I'll be the moderator during this session. And I just want to let everyone know that this session is being recorded so that everyone who has signed up will have access to the recording afterwards. Climate change, or as we now know to call it, the climate emergency, is perhaps one of the most pressing issues that we now face. However, as a global community, we have to change our attitude from a simplistic reduce emissions to a more socio-political, systematic way of thinking to have just and long-lasting, impactful solutions. From colonialism to imperialism to the current climate emergency, the global north has continuously sacrificed the global south through resources, exploitation of resources and wealth, be it of people and of natural landscapes. And this is just one example of why we must ensure that the solutions that are created to fight the climate emergency are created through a socio-economic political lens to ensure that we do not deepen the injustices. Not only does the global north exploit the global south, but the global north is also responsible for the majority of emissions, while being the least affected. In fact, there are even occasions where countries in the global north benefit from climate change, such as Norway, who has managed to see a 30% increase in their economy due to climate change. At the same time, countries in the global south suffer economically and environmentally from droughts to crop instability to floods to cyclones. All of these environmental issues that countries face can be directly associated to climate change. And for the most part, people in the global north get to avoid these devastating consequences. We must work towards climate justice by reframing these environmental issues and reframing them as socio-political ones. And a key tool to do this is communication. Communication as a way to make sure that communities' voices are heard and listened to. Communication as a tool to mediate between different stakeholders in different environmental conflicts. Communication as a tool to shift power dynamics, and communication as a tool to spread stories of people who are suffering. Luckily, we have the pleasure of having three speakers today who will be able to tell us how we can use communication in the fight and the strive for climate justice in the world we live in today. Our first speaker will be Yemi Adeyeye, who is currently a GLFX Global Coordinator at the Global Landscape Forum, working to enable and accelerate action towards a more sustainable landscapes. He holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia in Canada on multi-scalar and participatory aspects of resource governance. Yemi's experience spans across many countries and a variety of international NGOs, with a focus on the intersection of people and power in landscape governance. In his talk, Yemi will focus on addressing three aspects: communication as a tool, the roles of narrators, and some do's and don'ts of communications while seeking climate justice. Our second speaker, Irene Iniesta Arandia, is a researcher at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and a member of Fractal Collective. Irene is currently training as a facilitator in the School of Process Work of Barcelona and holds a PhD in ecology from the Autonomous University of Madrid. Irene's research focuses on the interactions between environment and society, with a focus on environmental feminism, political ecology, and the social ecological systems perspective. Last but not least, we have Rowan Pybus, a South African impact producer and founder of Makulu, an ethical media communication agency, and also a co-founder of Sunshine Cinema, a network of youth-run mobile solar-powered cinemas, which showcase African films with diverse audiences. With Makulu, Rowan has created award-winning short-form environmental films with an emphasis on sustainable impact. And through Sunshine Cinema, ensures that important environmental stories are shared and discussed across Africa, thereby sparking essential conversations. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind the three speakers that we are on a bit of a strict timeline. So it's 15 minutes, and I'm afraid I will have to interrupt you if you go over. And to everyone else, we will, at the end of the three speakers, we will have a question and answer debate time. So please hold your questions until the end of the three speakers. So over to Yemi now.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Carla. Thanks so much for the introduction. Let me start by sharing my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, perfect. So I would make the time, Carla. I think I will. So I would speak more generally about communications and climate justice, but focusing on three aspects that I think will be useful to frame our conversation. Because based on my understanding, there's still going to be some dialogue and debate between us, which is going to be the sweet part. So I will look at communication as a tool, the power of a narrator in communications, and a few do's and don'ts from my own experience. So before I go into the talk, I like to frame my opinion so that you know where my thoughts are coming from. I'm a Nigerian, and I'm also a trained social scientist. I work within the space of forest, agro-food systems, people, places around the world. And I need to also be clear that I'm not really a communication expert. So whatever I say is going to be coming from the perspective of someone who is a social scientist, who has engaged in this topic under different conditions and who has worked with different groups around the world. So this is a particular picture we've all seen before, whether when we were in primary school or in high school, or when you were reading something about communication. This is quite popular, maybe a different version of it, but I just want to use this one to illustrate what communication actually is. We all know this. There is someone who is the sender, someone who is sending a message, a narrator, as I would call it in social science. There is the message in itself. In social science, we call that the story. And then there is a receiver, someone who received the message. And then there is a feedback, potentially. So the reason why I framed that conversation starting from that point is because when you communicate, we need to know that all these aspects of communication exist. But then from what we're going to be talking today, I want to start off by giving some few pointers on the message, the story from the social science perspective. So when you engage in climate justice conversation, debate, or project, we need to understand that every story that we have, everything that is known that we want to share or communicate, or something we're trying to find out, are usually embedded in context. Usually they invoke meaning, which means when you speak or when you communicate a particular content, it could turn into different things. It could be misunderstood. It could be understood in different ways. So one key important thing about this story is that it needs to be understood first by the person who is the narrator. You that you're sending the message, and then the person who is receiving the message. Because when we talk about climate justice, socio-political lens of seeing things, some people being disenfranchised, some being empowered, this whole system sometimes is framed around communication, how we tell a story. And from you as someone who is in school, say, taking a graduate degree, you would likely be someone who is privileged in a particular system. You're probably going to be someone who is sharing something that is going to be known about some particular people, maybe their experience, as a climate refugee, their experience as someone who is trying to adapt to changing climate. So one thing that is quite important is respect and acknowledgement. Respect the story, acknowledge where the story is coming from, respect the way you share the story. Know that people are going to probably misunderstand or understand based on how well you do your job, which takes me to the next point, the power of a narrator. You as the person who is sharing a story, either as a student, maybe you're doing your project work, or you're already working in a, say, climate related institution, something of that nature. You as a narrator, you are the custodians of people's story. So most usually you are not participants of a particular experience in itself, but you are there to maybe speak to people or observe a particular ongoing change in a particular landscape. And when you see that, you are going to be in a situation where you tend to have the opportunity to communicate it in certain ways. So you need to know that as a person who is empowered, or as someone who has the power to tell this story, I am a custodian of this story, I'm a shaper of this story, and I can either use that story to reproduce empowerment or disenfranchisement. And I will tell you what I mean. Usually, or as a form of an advice, as a narrator, when you engage with people's story or you want to communicate a particular content, one key thing you always do, even when it relates to people or just to things, you ask yourself, what am I sharing to the receiver? And what does the receiver now know about the story? These two questions beckons a responsibility from your side as someone who is communicating. What the people will know, what a receiver will know, what an audience will know about something is not just all about the story in itself, it's about how you share it. And this is a particular good illustration that I used in a particular talk some months ago. I think that was late last year. You know, I went online and I was trying to understand how do we frame people who depend on forest and livelihoods around the world. There's a particular commonality. We usually use some particular illustration to show people who need help, people who depend on forests, people who are, say, climate, people who are at the downside or who are experiencing climate in a different way. We frame them in this way, as, say, you know, this dark brown color scheme illustration. But when you talk about people who are empowered, people who are forest scientists, people who are well experienced technicians, people who frame stories, we frame them in like white skin color, whatever, you know. And
Yemi, sorry, Yemi, we lost you for a second there from when you changed the previous slide.
Okay. Is it which slide number? Is it slide 8?
No, we heard this. It was the next slide.
Slide 9.
Yes, from here.
All right. Okay. So what I'm explaining here is an illustration of the power of narrators. And I'm using two illustrations to show what that could mean when we take a space of being narrators. So these are Google images. Now, two things here. This is not the problem of Google. This is the problem of how we illustrate stories over time. So Google basically work on algorithms that basically capture what we tend to do. So this is an illustration of human behavior. So now the first image on this side, which is forest and livelihoods, look closely at those images. Look at what you're seeing. This is a particular illustration of a particular type of people. So which means when we look at people who depend on forest, this is what picture we usually use to show that. And in the right sense of the word, this is kind of wrong because it's not just these guys who will depend on forest. Look at when we talk about forest scientists and forest technicians, people who are, you know, educated or who are exposed, exposed based on the Western definition of what that means. White skin color, people from the global north, and so on. That is also not true. But where this becomes important is this, that when you continue from this, when you take the space of a narrator and you continue to use a particular type of imaging to represent a particular kind of story. So over time, the image becomes the story. So if you want to communicate poverty due to climate emergency, and you use some particular kind of images of some particular kind of people to continue to communicate that particular experience, you make that image or that experience the illustration complete of that image. So where that leads us, it is some do's and don'ts based on my own experience. So there are some few do's here. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are ones that I think could be helpful when we work as narrators. Always recognize your position and be honest. Remember, you may hold some power and people may see power when you interact with them. Be honest, communicate it. Put faces to story. You're custodian of stories. You're not, if you put faces to the story that you're telling, it is a signal of respect. And people can better understand and perhaps empathize when they get in touch with you or when they receive your story. Convey the right message. It's always important to know skew the messaging. Communicate what is right. Always calibrate your approach based on the story and the receiver. Remember, when you communicate to people who may not have an experience at all about a particular thing, you may need to communicate in a particular way so they may understand. So move things around a little bit. Always ask yourself this key question. Am I fulfilling my duty as a custodian of the story to the owners of those stories? Are you doing right by them? When people entrust you with their story, maybe you go to the field and you ask people questions about, hey, what's your experience about this thing, this changing climate in your landscape? They might give you things that are very, very confidential. Are you fulfilling your duties with the story they've told you? Are you telling it the right way? So some don't. Please don't be disrespectful and entitled. Sometimes we tend to make this mistake. Sometimes it's not intentional. When you come in contact with people in the field, respect how much they are willing to share, and even if they are not willing to share at all, don't share what is confidential. I've said that before. And the third one is don't share stories that will further entrench a negative illustration of the people. This is quite common these days. Sometimes you go on media and you see that when there are some particular negative news to be communicated, the particular illustrations are used for some particular type of people. That is not the same for other types of people. Please don't fall into those particular wrong deed. So these are just a few lists. It's not exhaustive. We can still have this conversation after. So thank you. This is just a presentation to frame the dialogue we're going to have. So hopefully we can get more into it when we start to have the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yemi, for those very useful do's and don'ts, and particularly the bit about the narrators as guardians of stories. We will now move on to Irene, who will talk to us about her experience in Spain, working as a researcher in socio-ecological environments.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I just wanted to share a bit my experience. Also, I'm going to start talking about myself. I was trained as an ecologist, so my background is on natural sciences, although during my PhD, I got into social sciences and the humanities. And that's also how I became also a facilitator, right? Because I had the need to engage with people on the field. Mostly, my research is related to studying traditional natural resource systems in Spain. So I mostly work with farmers and irrigation, and now I'm starting to work with fishers here in Barcelona. And I'm really interested about how they perceive what I tend to call, I work more with global environmental change than climate change, because sometimes when we talk about climate change, it seems like it reduces to emissions or to certain things. So I tend to ask them, okay, what do you notice from 50 years ago to now, and what's changing, right? And most of the times what I find out is that climate change is adding to the pressures they've already experienced. But as resource users in Spain, most of them, traditional users, are disenfranchised, and they've experienced many other pressures that climate change. So my experience is mostly as someone who that's not communication, but more participation and engagement with stakeholders. And that's what I've been doing most of the years. And in my presentation, I just wanted to take a reflective look at as a role as scientists in academia, and following a bit on what Yemi was saying about the role we have, and the power dynamics we have. So I just wanted to frame that as scientists, most of the times, the model we're shown is that we as scientists have to look for solutions and hand out those solutions to managers, and then policies will be implemented, no? And this has been the reason for many conservation projects to fail. In Spain, we have many of these examples, or we can see them in national parks when they were established. Most of them, they were established without people knowing, or knowing from very different sources, and this turned out as users rejecting these parks. One particular big example is in Doñana. Doñana normally it's a place that is very polarized. Research users are very polarized with biologists, and there's very bad communication among them, no? And another trend that we are seeing now is that we are asked increasingly to co-produce knowledge, right, with stakeholders. I think this is very good news. At the same time, we're asked to do things that as scientists, we most of the times don't know how to do. And we also have our own views, right? We as scientists tend to see ourselves as apolitical. So we think we research facts, and we don't tend to see ourselves as subjective. So most of the times this is a problem, even as how we set the engagement process and what we expect from people. And I think one of the lessons we need to learn is how to deconstruct ourselves. And I think this is very important, and I need to say all the time, we need to reflect on our role, and it's very important that we always keep in mind when we are opening a space, what are we expecting from that space? How are we gonna reciprocate people? What are they gaining from them participating in something that we establish, right? And I think this is a problem that we still deal with, right? When we are talking about co-production, now a lot of facilitation and engagement processes are taking place, but most of them are also established by scientists, and we don't really know how to do that. So we tend to have our own agenda, we tend to think on our objectives, and I don't think most of the times we pay attention to what are the needs of people, what are they gonna get, and I think this should be like one of the first things we talk about. And I think, as I was telling, that this was a problem mostly in conservation projects, but I think this still a pervasive problem also within climate science, no? And how these big IPCC or IPBES are dealing with science, no? We can see in the proportion of people that are forming these panels, mostly are men from the natural sciences, from the global north, and increasingly even IPBES is doing an extraordinary job trying to work with local ecological knowledge, with indigenous knowledge, with local users and with indigenous communities. What we find out in the end is that people who are participating are people who know about local knowledge. So researchers who know about local knowledge, but not so much indigenous communities and local users. Because in the end, IPBES is a place that is a scientific and a political enterprise. So in the end, you're asking people to come to something that you've created, right? And certain scales might also be very complicated. I was asked to talk about how to include different voices. for me, in my experience, one of the most important things is building trust among communities. And this is something that is hard because most of the time it takes a lot of time, and this sometimes crashes a bit with academia's reality of 4-year projects, of precarity. But I think once you spend a lot of time in the field, you engage with people, then it's going to be very easy to get people to come to workshops. This is my experience in our work in Almeria in southern Spain. We spent there a lot of time, and we were living in the places, and then it was very easy to engage people for when we were we were doing some sessions of giving back the results of what we had find out, and also establishing conversations about what they thought that these results meant to them. Yeah, so for me, trust means basically having politics of reciprocity, right? Not only spending time with people, but also doing things that are important for people, and not only instrumental for you as a scientist. And finally, I think it is very important that we understand the power structures that we're sometimes embedded in, right? And I think, for example, as a scientist, we're mostly limited by fundings, by incentives. So for us, we don't have incentives to do outreach, and we don't have incentives to engage people. These are things that we can do, and increasingly we can engage with this, but our incentives mostly are to publish in academic journals, international journals. So this is very much what we spend time doing. And this is a problem for us. So I think, for example, for us, communication is essential. And most of the times we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to engage. Communication for us in our daily basis basically is when you finish a project or when you finish a paper and you write a press note that you're not sure that it's going to be received well, because we tend to be very specialized and we lack this kind of engagement. So for example, now on the Institute of Science and Technology, I'm collaborating with the Environmental Justice Atlas, and communication is key. So we have a person that engages with communication, and what we do in the Atlas is we report cases of environmental conflicts in the world, and also the resistance strategies that people have created, and also if they've won some of the cases or not. So these cases, so there's a person that publishes these cases daily. So daily there's a case of like a case in Canada, in different countries, and what were the strategies of the communities. And I think this is great. And also in the Institute, there's a person that engages with press. So she tries to move things on social networks, and she asks all the time information from us. But we really, in our daily basis, we don't have this type of communication with people who know about communication. So most of the times, I don't know, I'm thinking, I would love to work with someone who knew how to, I don't know, make a documentary I work with farmers, I work with fishers. I would love to have their stories out, no? And most of the time what I ask them is to tell me about their lives. And I think this is wonderful material, but I really don't know how to do it because I am in an academic silo, right? So I don't know really how to engage with that. So I think, yeah, sometimes understanding that we are embedded in these structures and that we have stereotypes most of the times about what other people do, it's very relevant also in knowing how to engage further, communicate further, and make participation possible. And this is everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena, for that intervention. We will now move on to Rowan, who will talk to us about
Hello, everyone.
his media campaign.
Thanks, Carla. Can everyone hear me all right? Is that okay?
Yes.
I appreciate it. So my name is Rowan. I'm sitting in Cape Town, South Africa, and I have a background in storytelling at a grassroots level. And I'm just going to quickly share my screen to try to take you through some images that might contextualize that a bit more. Let's see how this this goes. There we go. Can you all see what I'm seeing now? Let me bring it onto the screen so that I can. All right. Okay, so we'll go to the first slide here. Okay, it looks like you can see what I'm seeing. So really what we're about is two things: sharing and creating media, creating a story and sharing a story. And I really enjoyed parts of the presentation, all of the parts, both presentations, in fact. But what Yemi touched on earlier, which I really appreciated, was the ethics of storytelling and the representation of that. And when, as storytellers on the ground here in the sort of the global South or Southern Africa, I've had the fortune of telling stories for global corporations, and I've now chosen to focus specifically on impact campaigns, and our clients on Mukulu's side are various UN and philanthropic agencies. So we were making stories, and then the issue of who got to access those stories arose in our journey. And so we started to develop models of distribution that were just not available or around us at all. We saw the need to create screening spaces, media sharing spaces that allowed for conversations to be had in vernacular languages around issues that were very local but global. We started by making a film that I'm going to share in the chat called Amazing Grace, about a farmer in Zambia named Lloyd Manina. And he went from being a charcoal burner, which is essentially a person who cuts down trees, turns it into charcoal and sells it to the market, because we still have huge power issues in Southern and Central Africa when it comes to how we cook our food. Most of that is happening still on charcoal in peri-urban and rural areas. And we realized that this film needed to, the film did very well. We got a call from the UN and were asked to go to forums on deforestation all over the world, and Nat Geo called, and all this stuff happened around the online presence of the film, but the grassroots presence of the film was eluding Lloyd. So we took all of our prize money and we developed a solar-powered cinema network project, which has now evolved to a pretty substantial nonprofit called Sunshine Cinema. We operate under the idea that we spark conversation using African-made documentaries and feature films. And we do this with various Sunbox ambassadors. I haven't updated this slide. I apologize. It's now close on 40 Sunbox ambassadors, and we're really enjoying the process of expanding the project. We do this idea of I think enabling young people to spark their own conversations using a tool called the Sunbox. And what I've done is I've pioneered a little solar-powered cinema in a box with our sponsors, and we load this with 50, 60 African-made documentary feature films. And they cover a wide gambit, a wide array of issues, especially environmental. And so with this tool, we do a lot of capacity and training. We bring our Sunbox ambassadors to various camps and bring in experts on entrepreneurship and facilitation. And we essentially then hand over the Sunbox for a 6-month period as a paid learnership program, where you are identified as a Sunbox ambassador to distribute media to your community in a way that gets the needle moving. We have a lot of apathy across Southern Africa around very, very big issues. And this is one way that we've managed to get people moving. So typically a Sunbox is a mobile solar-powered cinema. It's all about sparking conversation, and it's all about young people We also have a big mobile solar-powered cinema that we operate across Southern Africa. We've worked with amazing organizations like Participant Media in America, who made The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, and we've done tours across the continent with the best of the best films, and we'll take over very meager halls, humble spaces, and we'll screen to 200, 300, 400 people. We also use these events to launch Sandbox ambassadors at site, so that this idea of the circus coming to town, which is long established in colonial history of Africa, cinemas were a huge tool of propaganda for mining companies, etc. We're kind of decolonizing that idea by coming to town and then launching an activist, a voice within the community, a Sandbox ambassador. And that Sandbox ambassador then is able to move the needle for themselves in the community. So when you look at, typically we'll screen in daycare centers, old age homes, wherever. And we know that we're sparking, we're planting a seed. And I think that's important. Our projects in Malawi have been very interesting. One of our Sandbox ambassadors was able to take videos that we went and made around successful farming practices taught by Rainforest Alliance and the Ethical Tea Partnership organization. We filmed short stories, we loaded them onto the Sandbox, and we toured those accounts of successful farming practices which mitigated a certain amount of deforestation, which increased farmer yield, increased people's income. Those personal vernacular accounts of success at a grassroots level, filmed professionally, but then toured, have seen a huge uptake in the Farmer Field School program that Rainforest Alliance runs in Malawi. So that's been interesting to have a Sandbox ambassador in Malawi, many of them touring. We've operated in Bulawayo, and typically we try to get as many activists and we would say clear thinking, people with integrity to stand up and say, this is what we're trying to do around an issue. In terms of communication, we're also training a lot of people to tell their own story. So we run a lot of online sessions, especially in Zimbabwe right now, about how to deal with the historical differences between the Shona and the Ndebele people, which has not been talked about. We're training young people who are Ndebele to log that historical story. And so this experience has evolved into a course that we're launching at the moment. We're piloting at the moment for the next year. We've got 20 people. It's a partnership with UCT that teaches how to do a lot of the things that Yemi touched on. How do you come into a space and kind of move the molecules and get the room talking around important issues? Especially for me, I'm deeply passionate about conservation. Forests are a huge thing for me, and I want people to understand we are on a very climate emergency, exactly right, Carla, and we need to get people to understanding trees. So this course is a way for us to speak to the world and launch a course that teaches what we do, and hopefully enable a lot more people to be on the ground doing their own facilitation, their own conversational events based on our kind of 10 years of experience. So I'll round off by just saying, there's some. I wanted to quickly round off by actually touching on the key points that were sent to me. So if you can let me, I'll stop sharing the screen now. Excuse me for a second. So the experience on how to include different voices in environmental conflict research and the importance of their inclusion, how public engagement activities can serve as a tool for their studies, these studies. I really have a lot of experience in getting people to publicly come together and engage an issue and have a very prickly conversation from opposite points of view. And unlike the generation today who can't stand to have an online conversation, they just are siloed and very opinionated, and it's my way or the highway. We're finding that we're getting a lot more action and momentum by having different points of view in a room and facilitating that discussion meaningfully. The different narratives and experiences to higher level, we've had some success with that. We will make a film and it will reach the decision makers, the plenaries of the United Nations. We've had audiences with environmental ministers. based on communication tools that were developed at an extremely humble level, a very important level. And so there is a way to make the door open to the powers that be. Unfortunately, corruption is extremely pervasive in many sectors in Southern Africa, especially when it comes to trees as a resource rather than trees as a global asset of refuge. How some conversation initiatives fail due to lack of communication. Look, that is an art in of it itself. I think we have a lot to learn from each other across different continents on important global issues, and one of them is the forests and of South America, Northern Europe, and Central Africa. These are places that I truly believe need to be immediately protected. Every single ancient tree that's being cut down right now in DRC 24 hours a day is contributing to the global climate crisis. Every single tree, not thousands of trees, every one of them. So we have to get together like this more and be very vigilant. So it's been a lovely privilege to be invited to speak, and I thank you for the time you've afforded me to speak.
Thank you very much, Rowan. I met Lloyd, who Rowan was talking about at the beginning of his talk, in the video Amazing Grace. And it is, after seeing the video Amazing Grace, I then went to Zambia and worked with Lloyd on deforestation. And I have to say that it is a fantastic video. So I'll send you all the link later so you can watch it. We will open now the floor for questions. So does anyone have a question? Well, I can ask a question first if no one has one. So this is to the three of you. Do you think that it is possible for us to actually have an effect, and a long-lasting effect, with the, let's call it the economic system, the capitalistic system of the world being the way it is? Do you think that it's a possibility to actually create change, or do we need to dismantle the system first? Nice light question to begin the debate.
Yeah.
If anyone. Yemi, what do you think?
I saw that coming, Carla. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. I mean, it's a question everyone wonders, right? Like, hey, what are we gonna do? Should we just a luta continua, get the system down, break it down, and and fix it? Okay. Two answers. The first answer is that I believe we can make change. I believe, and for me, defining change is very important first, and also defining our expectations. And for example, yes, it would be nice if we can just break the system, right? And just fix it all. And there have been various attempts in the past across history to break down systems. Some have succeeded to different degrees, and things have changed to different degree as well. And yes, so we can make change. And yes, I think what is important here, what I would say, I'm hoping to what other speakers would have to say about that, is that we should understand that change is not just that one thing. Change is, it could be nibbling on the problem piece by piece, and then making progressive change over time. Which means in our own little space, for example, being a graduate student on this kind of topic, understanding the present situations of things, the imagined problems, and our space and our own role in it, how we can tackle a small thing in our own space, how we can make sure we are effective communicators in the domain of climate justice, how we can ensure that we give credence to the right stories, like what Rowan was saying. I think I really enjoyed Rowan's presentation, and I think we will be talking more on also potentially how we can have you speak in GLF, because I think you're doing something great, and the people really need to see that. The thing is, trying what we can in our own little way, getting the progress bit by bit, and not really focusing much more on saying, let's break down the system, because we may not be able to do that in our own, with what we've got. But who knows, maybe when we continue to nibble at it with time, our change is going to be, when we aggregate the efforts and the outcomes, it could make significant difference. That's what I would say. Good question, really.
Thank you very much. Jenny or Rowan?
I just think change happens all the time. So I think it is very important that I agree very much with Yemi that we need to create change in our environments. And also I think it is very important to keep in mind what kind of potential change we want, right? Because I think it is important to make us advance, right? If we have like a long-term objective that we might not see, but we might want other generations to see. So I think it is important to have both. If we focus only on the long term, we might get frustrated, because I think change happens and then also backlash happens. So no, and social conflict is there. But I think it is fundamental that we create change every day. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything to add, Rowan? Your microphone is off, Rowan.
Sorry, I just was saying I agree with both the speakers. I do believe change is possible. I must admit that I'm extremely practical in my application of how I go about change. I look at real world scenarios that are the converse of change. What is causing the problem and how does that happen at a local level? And I look at that very closely, and then I try and be an equal opposite to that. So a wave cancels a wave. So you can make change at a local level by addressing a systematic problem in one area, and then you can scale it. So for example, if you can manage to take one village in Zambia, for example, and convince them that no, cutting down trees for their daily energy is not the way forward, and we need to workshop other solutions and get something right. Let's say that a program works, then you can scale it and you can slowly stem this seemingly unstoppable tide. I do believe that we have to be that dogmatic and that committed to local solutions rather than this idea of like the global picture of global warming and it's all going down and what do we do? No, that to me is that's rhetoric. That to me is failed communication to drum up support and solutions for what we're going through as a collective planet. You have to be where you are, and you have to look at the problem close to you, and you have to start something. So a short story is the Lloyd story. If you look at, we made this huge global program for Volkswagen, and it was all about junior football, and we traveled to 12 countries. We looked at our flights and we said, how much would it cost to offset those flights? And we took all that profit and we invested it in Green Pop, which is now a fundamentally successful tree planting organization and activism group. And that's that recognition of my own role in something, and then not being greedy with the profit. It's social capitalism. It's some sort of hybrid model where we teach people to be more reflective on their actions and be more accountable for their individual actions. I don't know. It's a big problem. But what happened to us is that from that one choice, we now have an ethical media agency. We now have a pretty successful solar powered cinema network and the incidental tree planting organization, which functions in its own right. And it's because we just were very focused at a local level about something we couldn't turn a blind eye to. So change is possible at a local level. I think globally, maybe we'll get the algorithm right and brainwash everybody in the right direction, but who knows?
Thank you. Yes.
But don't you think that the three of you said that the local changes has to come first in a way, that global changes, so global efforts. But I think that India, Latin America in general are showing us that this frustration blows up. So every local effort is diminished by the explosion of social rage that is now evident, like Chile, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, India, and other countries that, I don't know, the long list of places and that's not local. Because we can do many things in Argentina, we can do many things in Ecuador, in little village, but the social pressure and the social exhaustment blows up a country. So I really truly think that local efforts are very, very important, but they cannot overshadow an effort that we have to do collectively. So my question is how to use these local efforts in a way that are like at service of a huge thing, because they must be at service of a social, not local project. But before there is a project, they are gonna explode. Maybe the global north is not gonna explode, but the global south is exploding already. So local things, it's like how do you say, a patch over a wound? Don't you think?
I think the response to that is that obviously there are levels to this, and it's an intricate situation. What I can say is just from personal experience that once you do focus on a local level, and remember we're talking about communication, so I think we made a piece of communication that ultimately ended up being given an audience with the environmental minister of Zambia, and it accelerated from a very local level all the way up to the top. And then there's a different process that happens there, whether or not your leadership are corrupt or complicit in the problem themselves, and they have a huge amount of apathy to do anything. And that's where I think your point is very valid, that you need to mobilize. So along the way of getting up to having an audience with real decision makers, we have to mobilize together through the communication of the film as well, and build groundswell and build support. Now, that is a hard thing to do, but we're getting to a place in the Global South now where people are seeing just the incredible runaway, the word trillion. If you just, the word trillion, how much was the word trillion said last year, and then the previous year, and the previous year? It's unbelievable how the 0.0% are amassing wealth in the global north. So we're starting to see the need to create massive programs, yes, on a global level. I still believe that I saw a tree getting cut down, and that is the important issue. So I stay at the local level as a compass heading, and then I try to get as high up and create as much noise as possible, for sure, absolutely.
I think I have a sort of maybe a somewhat diverging but complementary feedback to what Ronald just said. As someone who worked within the global local nexus and examining policy development across those skills, I have a simple answer and a more complicated answer. A simple answer is that an effort at change at any level of governance does not negate an effort at change at another level. The reason why I'm saying that is that we are in a globalized world where policies in France can very quickly change actions in Congo. And we are in a situation where United Nations declaration, no matter how complicated or simplified it is in terms of giving statement that can actually affect change, it could still lead into the insurrection of change on the ground, no matter how small it is, and vice versa. So which means change in itself, from my perspective, needs to be driven across these different levels. So local change should happen, and people should continue to reinforce that with the understanding that there's a need for complementarity with other change that are driven at other levels where change is needed. So what I do, for example, with my office in Bonn, while sitting in Calgary, is somewhat driving what is happening in Nairobi in terms of, say, local change towards landscape restoration. At the same time, what I'm doing in my home in Calgary through my office in Bonn and Indonesia could also be very redundant if the effort on the ground is not there. So to answer to give a sort of an additional comment to what Rowan is saying, we should not it's understandable why we may see many reasons why change is hampered at the levels where we coexist with the need for those change. But we should remember that we need to continue to strive and drive those changes, because others in different levels are equally trying to contribute to this change. So, and then finally, we should remember that the aggregation of all the many changes around the world is what could culminate into a bigger change that will actually change the world.
Yeah, it's important to be optimistic. The quickest way we lose this battle is through just being a victim of the problem and falling into a space where we don't actually try and explode our brain in an optimistic sense, because it can be utterly overwhelming. Yemi, I just want to touch on, if you drive from Cape Town to Nairobi overland and you start to catalog the effect of deforestation and the visual scale of the problem, it can be extremely soul destroying for someone who's tried to raise the awareness of this issue, at a global level. But at a local level, the problem is so pervasive and so entrenched that it seems insurmountable. And you can be filled with rage, for sure, and you can get very angry. And I think that there is I'm on the opposite side of anger and rage. I've gone down that road and I don't like it. I think that there's optimism, there's kindness, and there's momentum and action. I'm not saying that you don't get angry. I get angry. I don't find it as a productive function of the solution. I find it as sort of just a vent, and then you've got to frame and carry on. A lot of people are getting really angry, and they tend to jeopardize opportunities with that rage to actually have mediated discussions with people and start to, be the drop in the conversation that becomes the river. They cancel that option of becoming the river at the get-go, because they're just, this is my enemy: rage, hate, and war. War is a direct function of that rage. I'm not trying to steer the conversation down, that level, but I do believe optimism, big deal.
I wanted to add. For me, the local level is always important, because I think it's where things are rooted. So for social change to happen, I think it's always important that there's local organizing, that after there's, right, like these are cycles, like there's something local organizing, then there's a big mass adding to change, and then there's social explosion, but then afterwards is always the local, I think, that is gonna make it's gonna make these processes crystallize. So I think it's always important for me. It's important to think of multiple skills, and as I said before, like you can act local, but I think there's always like a horizon in mind, that this local can be networked or can be upscaled, or
I think that was my point. Like all of these local
Right.
things has to work together, because
right. And this is something that, for example, with the Environmental Justice Atlas has been done sometimes to try and it's supposed to also be a tool for communicating between activists that have a problem with an oil company in Latin America, and then that same oil company is operating in other places. So how how to network these locals. I think it's also an objective in itself, but I think it is very important for me that these projects are grounded and rooted, because if not, I think this is important for the sustainability of the projects and the long-lasting effects, right? That after the explosion, there needs to be like change that can be crystallized, I think. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you very much. Is there any more questions?
Yes, I have a question for Yemi. You mentioned that people tend to be or to feel apathy towards climatic local issues. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Thanks so much for the question. This is where I was speaking about the role of narrators, right? That we as narrators, we can drive, we can use story to get some particular kind of outcomes that we want to generate. And it's important for us to understand that we have that much power as narrators. So there are two things involved here. There are people who are basically owners of the story. They are the one experiencing a particular event, a particular climatic event. Then there is us, who probably would have the potential to interact with those particular experience, get feedback from people going through it, and having the responsibility to communicate it to the outside world, either to policymakers or to other actors on the ground. And that is when our role becomes very, very key. And in so doing, because of the role we have, we can generate empathy if we tell the story in the right way. Not necessarily get a pity party going on, but at least generate the level of understanding and empathy needed from actors to be able to, or from policymakers or whoever need to hear those stories, could bring them into a space where those stories can effect change. So that power, such level of power, reside with us as storytellers and narrators. And with such understanding, for example, what Rowan does, Rowan, as no matter how small it is, somehow, somewhat, from what he does, it could make some people on the ground get excited about restoration efforts. At the same time, if he leverage his power in a particular way, it could also make, it could contribute to some, say, tell the story of some particular people in a weird way that generates some particular weird outcome. So the intentionality from our side as powerful people and the privilege we have is what we need to reflect on and leverage that appropriately.
Thank you very much, Yemi, for your answer. Does anyone, Rowan or Irene, would you like to comment on that answer? Are there any more questions? Oh, sorry.
I have one quick thing to add in relation to what Yemi's just said. The Rainforest Alliance approached us and said, we've got the Farmer Field School in Malawi, and we're teaching information that has been accumulated by other farmers that have figured something out that was working for them. So this wasn't the traditional external aid organization trying to disseminate top level ideas from another place that weren't relevant. Their approach was, we said to them, we want to film successful stories and present them back on a go down the road, one hall at a time, one village at a time, and just share the relatability of other people that you knew. But I mean, we're talking 5 kilometers. And with the funding, which again is this top level discussion of how do you convince the money people, the aids, the European unions to fund your program, you have to prove it works and you have to prove it has impact. So we did that. And what we've noticed is that if you have a relatable story and you communicate it with sincerity and the facts are true, and you can share that story down a literal road and create an end, a partial or a beginning of the end of deforestation and poor farming practices that lead to soil erosion, that lead to silting of rivers, which lead to flooding. Like when I worked with doctors at the outborders in northern Mozambique, the farmers were, they just didn't understand you can't farm on the slopes like that. They were pressured to farm higher and higher. It's communication at a grassroots level that can stem the tide if it's shared with the same ethics that Yemi has pointed out. And I believe in that, and I'm certainly going to dedicate the rest of my life to that approach because I've seen change. Now, what more do you want, in an online world where your apathy any given day based on a narrative that's been fed to, get you angry? I don't want to subscribe to that. I want to be a part of a network of people that have got some sort of program rolling out that does work. So I'm excited to continue doing what I do, and I'm super, super grateful for this forum because the people here are like-minded, and that's the other key ingredient to change, is finding like-minded people.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions, or anyone online? If you have a question, please write it in the chat or turn on your microphone. Or anyone here? I'll ask another question then. So the current energy discussion, sort of going a little bit down a different route. We hear a lot about renewable energy and renewable resources, but how does the transition from non-renewable energy to renewable energy impact people who maybe haven't even industrialized yet? And how can we make sure that the change from non-renewable to renewable is done fairly? Because I think that that's maybe quite a big challenge at the moment, that sure, we all want electric cars, but the copper and the cobalt needed for these electric cars, where's it going to come from? So do you have any thoughts or comments on that, Irene?
Well, I was thinking that recently there's a colleague, Sofia Avila, who defended her dissertation, and it was on energy transition in Mexico and globally. And I think it is also important. So I think one part of the discussion might be how to transition. The other part is like, what kind of governance model are we replicating? One of the things that she was saying is that there are renewable projects that are also creating problems with indigenous peoples, that are grabbing land. So I think we need to pay attention to that with either non-renewable and renewable. And the other thing is that, well, there seems to be also a growth in non-renewable. So we have to, we need like this, if this transition is happening or not happening. But for me, one of the important things is that we keep an eye on the governance of these new projects, because, and we can see it here in Spain, we have a lot of renewable energy, but that mostly is owned by the same electric companies. And so the model stays the same. So I think for a transition to be fair, we need to, there's a fundamental problem of changing these models, of making it more cooperative, decentralized, and I think this would assure somehow that the transition is more just, I think, yeah.
And do you think in Spain in particular, that change needs to come from us as society, or will it come from a higher up?
Well, I always think change comes from outside the system. So either there's a social demand, and I think there are alternatives, right? Like, for example, we can see here there are some cooperatives, but there needs to be somehow a critical mass. But I think the change is always going to come from the bottom up. I mean, for me to, for my ideas of like what is just, right? I think, yeah, it comes from the bottom up, and then it gets institutionalized, and then institutions take up these ideas. Yeah. because I think ideas mostly come from, most of the time from peripheries, not from the center. Yeah. Mm.
Does Yemi or Rowan anything to add?
I think very, very good point, Irene. That's a whole field of debate in itself, energy transition. And a lot of conversation is going on there. I used to have this colleague who was doing his PhD on basically energy transition in India, around cooking stove, what's this other gas called? Hydrogen gas or something like that. Anyway, so there's this whole debate on how fast can people transition and how does that vary from place to place. And you know what, I would like to bring this question back into this topic from the aspect of politics of communication and to discuss on where might we situate ourselves in this when there is an emerging issue in the whole broader debate of things. And we are experts in we are involved in having to communicate this particular issue, either as a student or as a professional. And, one thing that I think from my point of view that is important here is for us, from what Irene has said, for example, is for us to take the role of communicating the honest truth about this variation in the opportunities to transition. And for us to communicate that with all the strength we've got, so that policymakers more broadly, whether at the local level or the global level, would understand and bring back into reality or bring it to their own reality and be realistic that the pace or the pacing of this transition is going to vary from space to space, from different countries to different countries. I mean, there are countries in Africa. For example, I'm from Nigeria, Nigeria is still struggling to have 24 hours electricity. So the chances are mainstreaming electric cars in Nigeria is not going to happen in the next 1 decade. I'm not even trying to be pessimistic. That's me being optimistic, and that refers to a lot of other landscapes in, say, the global south. But then if we continue to drive such narrative and then only focus on policies that assume that the speed at which Germany would get to energy transition is the same, or is the same expectation, or is the same level at which a country from the global south would. And if we start to, because this is where the problem of policy comes in, right? When something becomes a topical issue in policy debate, and there are assumptions made about this topical issue that are not real. For example, we're going to transition into renewable energy fully in the next 10 years. Such policy conversation and declaration could lead into a lot of market movement. And then investors and people who are supposed to support actions on the ground start to focus on energy transition in a particular way. So which means some people who could have used some help because they are not going to be able to transition that fast become relegated. So those who actually need the investment support, no one is speaking for them. The focus has gone into those who are moving really fast. So sometimes when we undermine or we don't really reflect on how important all these many narrative and conversations can be, the implications is that people who are already suffering suffers more. And that's where our role as communicators become very important, to communicate in a really allyship way, to communicate the realities of many communities on the ground who would transition in a particular way because of the reality they have to face, and who would need more policy engagement and support to reach that particular end.
Thank you very much, Yemi, for that intervention. Rowan, do you have anything to add?
Just very briefly, this is the campaign that I think is worth building a coalition around. They've worked out that the Congo River, if it was dammed successfully in the right place, there would be environmental degradation according to this damming. But if it was dammed successfully, it could power Africa. Now, here's the flip side. If you continue cutting down the trees in Central Africa at the rate that DRC is doing, you don't get the precipitation that you used to get because the forest acts as a cooling mechanism, but it releases all that water and gives rise to the Congo River itself. The point that I'm trying to make is that we're fundamentally at odds with the direction we should take. And this is a leadership issue. So if we know the right approach, which is we could technically have a renewable energy source that could power the continent and really give rise to a myriad of ideas and solutions, we don't do it because, on the other hand, we're busy cutting down the very thing that could give rise to the renewable solution. So the point that I'm trying to make is we are at this point where we know that there are solutions and we have to become better communicators to share this story. It's astounding to me that because the Congo River is so wide and so big right now, that people can't see that the deforestation that's happening in northern DRC will one day lead to the complete demise of Central Africa. So yes, we could transition to renewable energy, but we don't because the dependency model that we currently are faced with has not been addressed.
Thank you very much, Rowan. I think we have time maybe for one last question, if anyone has one. Yeah.
So there are like too many things that we should do by communicating these different topics, like maybe lack of water, energy, deforestation. I would like to know, what do you think is the main message that we have to try to send, or that we should send to the people as our communicators? I don't know, what do you think?
Stop cutting down our forests. That's in all my learnings, in all my filming, in all my, if we don't stop cutting down the forests, everything that's wrong in this planet, from poverty, lack of drinking water, urbanization, the whole thing is just going to explode. The number one message right now, it's the same one as when the Amazon raised it with Greenpeace in the 80s. And it's just, we didn't connect the whole system. Forest in Africa plus forest in South America is part of the global ecosystem. If we don't stop cutting down the forests, we really are going to just lead to everything exploding more than it currently is.
That's okay, but for example, for me, that wouldn't be a local message. So how do I mix that two things, or different message, you know?
I guess I see it as both local and global, definitely, one at a time, and as well as presidents and leaders.
Yeah, I'm thinking, you mean like what type, like what to communicate in terms of like what driver of change is very important, or you mean like you mentioned pollution, climate change, or?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, like if I have just like one opportunity to say something to the world, something like that, what do you think is the main message?
Okay. I'm thinking for me, it would be something like to pay attention to. So I think like change now at local and global levels is not happening because of, we know the solutions, we know what are the problems, and there's like a social, right? There's a political, there's not a political will to change it. So I would put my efforts in how to upscale, or to pay attention to the projects and the social organizations and how the different communities and community organizers is making change possible, and how we can learn from that. Because I think sometimes these stories are not known enough, so people don't know, we often don't know models of what to do. So sometimes we can get just inspired by other ones. And I think, yeah, for me, it's very important to convey the message that we know what we need to do, and we've known it for several years. Science knows it, it's not like we as scientists don't need to look for new solutions. We know the solutions yeah, this is not happening. Yeah. I'll repeat it.
No, but it's okay. And Yemi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if I hear the question very well, but following what Rowan and Irene said, I would make some assumptions and I will provide my answer based on that. So I think there is something that I think also we need to remember, that yes, maybe some local change are struggling to be established. There are also a lot of other local change that are being established. So there are some that are not successful, yes. There are also some that are really, really successful. And bringing it back to the topic, we as communicators need our support is needed as communicators. Let's communicate those ones that are successful. Because when we communicate those ones that are successful, we invigorate the strength, inner strength needed by those who are struggling to know that, yes, we can make a change as well. And, let's also help them build networks, because that's one strength of local movement, local institutions, local agenda. Building network is increasingly better. They have the opportunity to do that than before. Now, local institutions for change can find friends who are doing similar things in other parts of the world and build alliances for cross-pollination of ideas, peer-to-peer learning, and so on and so. But then central to this is the strength and leveraging power of communicators. So much of strength and opportunities lies there. And we as communicators, from this conversation we are having today, is where we should move into that domain of using our power, recognizing that we are powerful and leveraging those power appropriately to fill those gaps that may exist.
Thank you very much. So I think that's all we have time for today, unless someone has another question. Well, I have one question. So I know next week, this week, the 11th, is the G7 summit in Cornwall, where in theory, important people get together to talk about what to do about the state of the world. But I wanted to know if you had any opinions about the heads of state that are invited to the G7 summit, that form part of the G7 summit, and whether really we can trust in these leaders. Like, is there really a point to these specific leaders getting together to do something if they only have, like, do they have global interests or do they have their own interests at heart? But maybe it's a bit of a, sorry, maybe the question got lost there, but any thoughts on that?
Well, I can
Go for it, Rowan. Go for it, Rowan.
Very short story that when we won an award and got flown over to Turkey to join the United Nations Forum on Forests, we thought this was a plenary of every country on the planet that was geared towards making change towards forest preservation. We were horribly mistaken. What we were as the communicators was the show pony of best practice and global problems relating to deforestation. And so when our scheduled time was allowed, it was like a Greta Thunberg. You're ushered in, you get to stand up and you say, here's the problem. But if you don't go with the flow, they try to take you away. If you stay in the plenary and you listen, they were only talking about trees as a resource, an economic tool. All the governments were just debating what trade deal they were doing, and this was renewable timber. Sure, some of it was renewable timber, but for the most part, they were actually debating and convening discussions about how to make more money from trees. So what we have to be very clear on is, what are our leaders discussing? And I think we need to have another campaign that promotes the entire thing, backdoor sessions, any sidebar. If you're a political leader, you need to be completely on the record and recorded for the discussions and the actions you've resolved to take at that summit.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. To be a bit more say, okay, let me just answer it this way. Carla, I think the G7 summit or G7 group, there are two things. One, they are very useful, and one, they are not quite useful at all. Useful in the sense that ignoring the power relation hierarchy dynamics that is associated to the formation of the G7 in itself, they are able to sometimes speak to, real issues, and they've been able to sometimes calm some situations and give some direction to some key things. And so from that perspective, yes, by all means, let them meet and let them talk about if they could make some change, no matter how small it is. From the other aspect of looking at power, from my point of view, and given history, because we cannot ignore history, I see a group of people who see themselves as powerful are congregating to further establish their power and to show the world that they are powerful and leading or driving agenda from the place of power. And as we all know, sometimes that may have its strength, because no matter, even on a micro scale, there's a need for leadership. But on the other side, it also has this, its weight of some people deciding the realities of others that they know nothing about, And those who engage in this decision making are those who refuse to diffuse that space of power by holding on to that space for so long, and for the continuous materialization of the power that they hold across space and time. So for me, that in itself is problematic. So it's a sort of a two-edged sword that, we can talk about this for almost a whole conference of how wonderful this is and how bad it is. But anyway, that's my point of view on that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, if you ask me if I trust these leaders, I don't trust. I don't think my role is to trust them. My role as a part of the society is to make sure they make the decisions that are beneficial for us. So either if they have good intentions, there's also the role that they play, right, as a state, and there's on one side the person and on the other the role. So for me, I don't want to trust them. I just want to hold them accountable, and I think they are gonna make the best decisions when we as a society can hold them accountable. Yeah.
And how do we hold them accountable?
Well, I think it's a question of really putting pressure, millions, society does it in millions of ways, right? Through demonstrations, through the press, when something gets published and it's unavoidable. I think there are millions of ways, but I think it's when they start feeling the pressure that what they're gonna decide is being seen by the world and is being heard, and people are kind of looking at them, right? So I think this is when they will start doing some good decisions. Yeah. But I think, communication there, it's key, right? Because I think one of the important things, for example, is that some of the counter stories get heard, and I think this is a problem now. When I talk about politics, some of and decisions not being taken because of politics is because of this. Because I think there are lots of lobbies, there are lots of interests, and I think there's really a need to hear other type of stories. Yeah.
Thank you. So if no one else has any questions now, we will come to an end. Thank you very much to the three of you. It was great. I think we can do a round of applause.
Also to Carla.
Thank you. And that's it, I think. Good night, good evening. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you very much to everyone, all the attendees as well. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.